It's not very stable. It is on? Hi, good morning everyone. We might begin. Welcome to this year's International Women's Day event. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that where we meet today has been the meeting place for the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples for thousands of years. I also acknowledge the cultures of any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people present with us today. My name is Osha and I will be your MC for this morning. I would just like to note that the bathrooms are located to my left. This morning we will hear from Ursula Kohler, Ashley Streeter-Jones and Craig Foster AM. After we hear from our panellists, we will have a quick Q&A before some morning tea. After morning tea, we will move into the breakout session. Rebecca Martin will be facilitating the discussion this morning. Please give her and our panellists a warm welcome.
Thank you, Osha. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today for the 26th International Women's Day event. I would first of all like you to say thank you to Osha as well for doing the acknowledgement of country. My name is Rebecca Martin and I work for the Department of Parliamentary Services. I am a proud Wiradjuri woman and I also have strong community ties to the Ngunnawal and Ngambri country as I was born and raised here. I joined the department in 2023 through the Indigenous Apprenticeship Program, and that journey has brought me to my role today as the coordinator for our entry-level programs. I am also the Secretariat for the Parliamentary Services Indigenous Employee Network, and I'm a proud Vocational Education and Training Ambassador after receiving the 2024 ACT Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Student of the Year Award. In addition to this, I am deeply committed to raising awareness of breast cancer in young women. Being a survivor myself, I use my voice to support others and promote education. This year's International Women's Day theme, Balance the Scales, is a powerful reminder of the need to build fair, inclusive and accessible justice systems for every woman and girl. Around the world, women continue to face legal, social and economic barriers that limit their ability to fully participate in society. This theme calls on all of us, institutions, workplaces, communities and individuals, to help create systems that uphold fairness. When justice is fair and accessible, it strengthens communities, supports safer futures and ensures every woman and girl has the opportunity to thrive. Today's conversation will help us reflect on what balancing the scales looks like in practice and how each of us can contribute to genuine lasting change. I am very pleased to introduce the panel joining us for today's discussion. So first up we have Ursula Kohler. Ursula Kohler is the founder and managing director of Capital EA with over 25 years of experience as an executive assistant across the Australian public service and private sector. A mentor and leader within the EA community, she is recognised for her contributions to professional development, leadership and supporting women in administrative professions. Next we have Ashley Streeter-Jones. Ashley is a gender equality and founder of Raise Our Voice Australia, and she has worked across youth leadership, gender equity and public policy. She has also been recognised as ACT Woman of the Year and Forbes 30 Under 30 listee and an Australian Financial Review 100 Women of Influence, and continues to empower young people to shape policy and political decision making. And finally we have Craig Foster AM. Craig is a former Australian national footballer, broadcaster and human rights advocate. He captained the Socceroos and later became one of Australia's leading voices on social justice, multiculturalism and refugee rights. He has worked across major sporting networks and served on national advisory bodies continuing to champion equity and inclusion. I'll now invite you all to introduce yourself a bit more and also ask, what does balancing the scale mean to you? We'll start with Ursula.
Thank you so much for allowing me to come and have a voice here in this wonderful place as well. So it's lovely to be here. So that was a really nice introduction, Beck, in terms of my background, and obviously I've had a long career supporting some of our nation's leaders, which has been a fabulous, long and amazing career, and where it's taken me, I don't think I would have ever thought it would get me as far as it did. So it's wonderful to be able to be here. Creating space, I guess, in the world that I've lived and shared in my journey is more or less about allowing people to listen. So for me, it's about listening, and for people to feel safe in my presence. One of the things that I've found over the years is that I've been someone to try and find solutions. And one of the things I've had to learn, predominantly in closer to the last 10 years, working with First Nations people, is about actually giving space to be heard and to be understood. So I think a big thing for me is allowing people just to be able to share what they want to share, and know that they're not being judged, in an environment that they can speak and there's no judgment.
Amazing. Thank you, Ashley. Introduce yourself. And
Hi, so I'm Ashley. It's lovely to meet you all. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. Who am I? It's a question that is so simple and yet so complex the second you're asked it. I'm a friend, a daughter, a partner, a sister, a volunteer, an employee. I am an adult who, when she was much younger, thought she was going to grow up and be a Pokemon trainer or a human rights lawyer. There was something about being an Ash in the 90s that just felt very serendipitous in a Pokemon career. I love good sushi. I love metalcore music. And I love the work that I get to do. And I really want to introduce myself as a person first, because I've worked really hard over the years to separate my identity from my work, and recognise that there's value in personhood as well as value in what we do. Balancing the scales for me has always been central to the way that I have moved through the world. And I think as a young person who was very curious about the world, I was, I think, about 11 when it first hit me in a very visceral way that this world was highly inequitable. And frankly, there's a lot of privilege in making it to 11 before you have that realization. But in that realization, I made a promise to myself that everything that I was going to go on and do through my career and through my life was going to be focused on balancing those scales. And in 2016, I moved to Canberra. I'd been doing a lot of youth-based activism and advocacy around politics and political shifting. And I was chatting to a friend, and we were looking at the news and at the political coverage, and went, we're spending a lot of time thinking about politics, but I don't see myself up there. Are you seeing any young people that reflect our background or our experiences? And it really shifted us into looking at, well, when we think about policy, when we think about change, when we think about decision making, politics is the biggest system in any country really that drives that. So how do we make sure that we have good, balanced, equitable representation, actually not just in our political system, but in all places where decisions are being made? So that was where Raise Our Voice came from. That is where my focus has been for the last 6 years. And while that is focused on specifically young women and gender diverse people, balancing the scales also looks like being in these spaces and always asking who's here, who's not here, why they're not here, what can we do to get them here, and how do we make this space a place where actually everybody can thrive?
Thank you, Craig.
Yeah, wow, that's really powerful from both of you. So it's lovely to be here. Thanks for the invitation to sit with three extraordinary women. And Rebecca, that's a great start. Well done. I know it's your first time here, so that was fantastic. So balancing the scales, I've had, I guess, the opportunity to work across a whole range of different fora. The older I get, and what I see is a lot of inequality, particularly with women across all of the different intersections in all of those different areas: broadcasting, governmental work, sitting on councils, multicultural work, communities, and certainly in sport. So sport gives us a platform to be able to speak about these things publicly. So I think we have a responsibility to at least attempt that, and also then to make change also institutionally, create reform, whether public advocacy or private involvement. So I think what I'll speak about through this thing, I think perhaps is probably a few issues that are contemporary and about balancing the scales in those areas. So we see the Matildas are playing tonight against North Korea in their quarterfinal of the Asian Cup. Hopefully they get through. I'm pretty confident they will. And we want to see them win a tournament here. And part of the reason we want to see them do that is because they have become such a powerful symbol for the empowerment of women in a lot of ways, because they demand a voice. They have fought for their rights. They've done all the things that you're talking about here. They've had to do it in the public space. They've been attacked for that. They're now, because they're a symbol of women's empowerment, of course they become a target. And so then we have a responsibility to protect them in a lot of ways. And also in the last few days, we had an interesting case with the Iranian women's team, you might have all seen. And that's another really important issue, because it shows that global sport is not a safe space for women. Right? So balancing the scales, part of my responsibility is then to work on the global scale and push athlete bodies to do better, push unions to do better, push United Nations to do better, push FIFA to do better. So, the advocacy can work on a lot of levels, and at the same time working through the media to try and use public leverage to move some of those plates.
Okay, thank you everyone. So sticking with today's theme, balance the scales, Ursula, I was reading one of your recent posts, and something that really stood out to me, that balancing the scales requires more than intention. It requires courage. The courage to confront systems that weren't designed for everyone, and the courage to redesign them. So my question to you first, and then to the rest of the panel, is how have you used your platform or experiences to create a safe space for people to feel heard?
Thank you. Yes, I think, given my own journey, what I found in being in spaces that aren't always equitable is I have had to use my voice and to stand up for things, and I encourage in the training that I do now to have that courage. And how to do it is simply what you believe in. And I think that the biggest thing is if you have that authenticity and that voice of reason, you'll get through to most people if you just speak up. The biggest thing is that most people have a fear of having that courageous conversation, and they don't want to upset the apple cart or be in a space where they're judged in any way for saying something wrong. So for me, it has involved some very courageous conversations. One I actually share readily in some of my training is sometimes it's easier done in a car. So I have pulled up a couple of senior bureaucrats in the car at times, and they had nowhere to go when I had that conversation. And yeah, as soon as I stopped the vehicle, I'm sure that they wanted to jump out and run. But it gave an opportunity as well where we didn't need to look at each other. I was driving, which probably made him very nervous. But it also just gave the moment where I could be courageous, and it was in a time frame of only about 5 minutes where I needed to say something and speak up. And so the courage has to come from a place of your passion and your drive and your authenticity, because that's where you hit the conviction side of things. And I think for me, it's made a big difference and leveraged me once that conversation was had and continued to be had. it just changed my life in actual fact, having those courageous conversations, yeah.
Okay. Would you like to add anything onto that, Ash or Craig?
Yeah, that gives me a throwback to being a teenager and having my parents get me in the car, actually. It's funny you say that. A time-honoured classic. How have I used my platform?
Yeah, how do you use your platform?
So I think there have been two ways for this. One is obviously having a more public-facing platform on which you can stand up and advocate things, and having a platform is a privilege. It's not a given. But really thinking about if I get to be a messenger for something, and it's not always about me. It's about what you get to share with people, and sometimes it's thinking, right, if I'm a vehicle for this message, what do we want that message to be? What do people get to know? But also, what kind of conversations can I have that other people might not have? What conversations can I have through my power and my privilege around issues perhaps like racism or homophobia or transphobia, where I am in more of a position of power because I will be listened to by perhaps a different cohort and take on also a different level of mental load around that. It's about allyship and being able to amplify those messages. And thinking about how you do that. But then also, I was thinking about it in a workplace context, and for me, I think this has also shown up a fair amount informally in my workplaces, where perhaps the platform hasn't been as formalised, and I've been more conscious about demonstrating my values, being quite forward-leaning about issues that I'm passionate about, causes that I'm passionate about, areas where I think I can influence conversation or make a change, or perhaps suggest something in a room where it's likely to get more cut through from me than it is with a colleague. If a colleague were to make the same point, I should say. Checking in with also more junior staff, so not staff that I'm necessarily managing, but staff who carry different levels of power in the workplace, and hearing what's going on for them and seeing how I can support where issues are coming up, whether that's offering to be a support person or seeing how I might be able to mention something in a meeting which again might be better received from me than is from someone else. So really thinking about the power that you hold and how you can use that power to be an amplifier or shine a light on something with the captive audience that you might have.
Amazing. Craig, I'm sure you've had your fair share of tough conversations through your work. How do we normalise having tough conversations to support progress and balance the scales?
I think, so I kind of work in a space where, all conversations are pretty tough in a way.
Yeah.
And I do a lot of things in human rights and others. And the only reason that those conversations are needed, whether they're public or private, is because people are in trouble, because people are attacked or demonised or removed from the public space or discredited and so on. So they're all tough. And so I think some of to talking to you guys who obviously, in a different environment, what I try to do a lot, building on what's already been said, is to just focus always on the issue and not the person, and try and keep the communication space open. I think it's something that we've become really bad in Australia at, and the media, particular sections of the media are preying on this by creating polarities in every conversation. Well, it's actually not a conversation anymore. It just has to be a fight all the time. And so I spend quite a lot of time in schools, talking to the young ones and encouraging the education system to ensure that we teach the next generation how not to do that, because our social media and our media are forcing everyone to take sides on everything. And if we don't take sides, there's no business model. So it's pretty simple. Right? And I work in the media. And so what that means is that actually being able to disagree with someone but not actually hate that person is a skill that we're losing as a country. And the media is teaching us to do this. And I think that's incredibly corrosive. It's extremely unhelpful. And all the social solidarity that we rely on is breaking down in part because of this way that we're unable to process difficult issues. So organisations like yours and all forms of environment, but I think particularly education system, needs to be able to teach the next generation of Australians how we approach difficult issues. So for example, I get attacked quite a lot publicly because I fight for people who are often demonised. But what I try to do, even at times it's difficult, I must be honest, I try not to attack back. It doesn't matter how viciously one is attacked, because all I'm doing is I'm showing the next generation of Australians that it has to be a fight. So I try to, the best I can, and it can be difficult at times, I try to model what it is that I want them to learn. I want them to see people in the public space, and for you, I would say, if I was sitting in your place, I'd be saying, I would want them to see in our corporate space or in our office space or in our institutional environment, I want everyone to see, or the new recruits to see, we're talking about culture here, I want them to see that when these conversations happen or I'm challenged in this environment, I'm able to handle it in a particular way. Because if I can't, then I can't expect others to do it. So I spent a lot of time thinking about, I'm going to wade into this issue here, I know this is going to be the response. If it goes this particular direction, which it might, what is my response going to be to that? What is my language? How am I going to calibrate what it is? You know, who am I going to talk to? How am I going to push back? You know, is it going to be firm? Is it going to be here? Is it going to be there? And of course, that often depends on the person that, you know, is doing so as well. Because people who, you know, wade into that situation who have less power than you've got to be very sensitive to make sure that you don't just come down and, you know, you can really hurt people badly. You can hurt their prospects, you can hurt their career. Just finally on courage, there's different forms of courage. I think at the moment, courage is a rare commodity in Australia because there's a very high cost for courage in Australia at the moment, a very, very high cost. I don't think it's ever been higher, actually. And so you're seeing a lot of people publicly attacked, like really viciously, a lot of women. So when that happens, irrespective of whether I agree with them or otherwise, I try, if possible, to support them, particularly women, because it's just ridiculous what goes on, you know. And so, you know, and within a corporate environment, which I've worked in a great deal, I have chaired, I have run, and so on, often it is about supporting people when it's least popular and supporting people when there is a cost to you. That is the ultimate form, in my view. When I know that it's going to hurt me, right, I know that it's going to hurt our family, I know it's going to hurt our financial well-being, I know this is going to be painful, there's going to be a lot of pain in the short term or medium term or even long term. And then you have to ask yourself the question, am I prepared to actually be consistent and do what I know, what I think is right? You know, we all have different views. What I think is right in this moment when I know that there is going to be a very serious cost. And I think we need more of that. And again, when that happens in all of our environments, I think we need to be the ones who actually say, yes, I'm going to do it, because that encourages, people see it. It might not make a huge impact overnight, might not make a huge impact in a couple of years, doesn't matter. The young generation definitely see it, and I want them to have that form of courage. Yeah.
Great. So this question is probably both to Ursula and Ashley. As an advocate for women and young people, what advice would you give to someone who wants to advocate for themselves but might feel like they lack the authority?
Yeah.
I love working with young people. They are by far my favourite group to work with because they are so full of energy, they're full of hope, they have these amazing big ideas that haven't yet been shaved down into something pragmatic or just beaten down by the world. Like that cynicism isn't necessarily there, and getting to sit in that space of hope and ideas is so fun and so energizing, and I think we need so much more of that. So what I would say to young people who want to advocate for themselves but perhaps aren't sure that they have the power or the space to take up, I would say you have so much to add. You're also the expert in your own experience. I'm really interested in this question of who gets to have expertise, and I think so often we discount, for young people in particular, their lived expertise, and we assume that because they're younger, because they haven't moved through the world in all the ways that people with, let's call it a bit more wisdom under their belts, have, they don't have as much to add. And it's never lost on me that we're having these big discussions about issues, perhaps such as housing or cost of living, these issues which are very intergenerational. And the reality is the experience of a young person today, who might be 15 years old, is different to what my experience looked like when I was 15, which is different to what your experience looked like when you were 15. There is inherent expertise in that and the reality of what living through that issue looks like for them. So I'd say you have so much to add. You're an expert in your own experience. Don't discount that. And actually, your advocacy makes the world better. When you stand up for yourself and you put that idea forward, we all benefit. And how much are we potentially missing out on because so many young people are reticent to step into these spaces. And don't get me wrong, we have a role to play as young people, as leaders, as allies, as advocates, to make those spaces make those spaces a place where young people want to come, they feel their ideas are heard, their ideas are actually heard, their ideas are valued, they're treated with respect, and they're treated as equals. And I'd really encourage young people not to devalue their ideas, and that you don't necessarily know where your ideas will land. There can be these amazing ripple effects that can be created by putting that idea forward in a room. And sometimes there's power in just planting the seed and then walking away. You won't always see that tree grow from the seed straight away, but planting the seed, planting that idea can be one of the most powerful things that you can do.
Would you like to add on to that, Ursula?
Yeah, great. That's lovely intro as well in terms of really enjoying working with young people and young women in particular. And I always think of a time of what really resonated with me growing up and with migrant parents. One of the most amazing opportunities, I suppose, that I grabbed hold of was that my parents came out to Australia with a suitcase, on the ship. And Dad said I'm one of 6 and 4 girls, right? But he always said, you can do anything. Look at the way we, came into the country with a suitcase. So one of the things was implying confidence. And I think one of the biggest, ways I can help young women and young people today is to give them a platform and to open that confidence up. I find the younger generation incredibly different and exciting, and some things that they say and come up with, I've had to stop and go, wow, that's quite amazing. And different views of looking at life in a different lens. And I think that's the way, my parents taught me a way that is very different lens, and now I've adapted my lens, and now we need to allow those younger generations to show us their lens on the world. We're all going through different journeys and chapters as we progress in this thing we call life. So it is, massively important for me to allow our younger generation to have that openness and to run free with their ideas and give them that platform. Yeah.
Amazing. Craig, did you want anything to add to that one?
What was the exact question again?
Sorry.
I was trying to make clear.
No, I'm going to have to backtrack. Well, actually, I can give you another one here. Sorry, work with all my papers here. You, Craig, with your extensive advocacy work across social justice and human rights, how do you use your platform to influence the environment around you, especially in spaces where women and girls may not be present in the room?
Yeah, okay. So I'll give you one example, but the thing is, what was said earlier is right, is just understanding, who is not there, and often it's female voice and rights which is the angle that I come at a lot of issues from. So, for example, in football, a few years ago, the players, Socceroos Matildas asked me to come back and be the chair of their Players Association, which looks after all their rights and so on. And I went to run a review, and what became clear is, this is only 2016, so it's not very long ago, it became clear that the Matildas and the professional women's players didn't have access to decision making. They didn't have a voice. They were members, but they didn't have a voice, which is pretty crazy. So what are we, 2026? So you're talking about, 10 years ago. And that was around the time where they were having to start to actually strike for their basic conditions. And so the male players, we made sure to educate them about the process that they had been through. So in other words, we created the conditions to make sure that they would be fully supportive of their rights. That's important. So that's an education process. And then we ensured that women would have access to decision making. And within 3 years after that, I think it's 2019, the Matildas signed an equality pay deal with the Socceroos. And what happened was there was a lot of angst around that deal because we were trying to work out whether the idea is to, whatever pool you have, there was a sense that in order to regulate it, that means that the men would have to give more across the table, to bring the women up. And others were saying, well, no, you've got to make this benchmark here because that's not genuine equality. So, that was a whole conversation. My view was that real equality meant that immediately the groups should be equal. And so we were able to, again, take the men through that process. And it was a groundbreaking deal in the world of global football because what actually happened was they pool all of their income now. And therefore everyone gets a genuinely equal share out of whatever happens. So the better either team goes, doesn't matter, because they are brothers and sisters. We do the same job, we're just in different teams, and therefore what is the difference between us? And so then we regulated all of their conditioning and coaching numbers and all that. You can imagine the staff that's put there. So the Matildas would have 4 staff and these guys would have 15 or whatever the case was, right? So everyone has the same staff. And then it was a matter for the governing body. If you have to make 15 here, you can't bring this down. So we need to keep those standards high. That was important. But it took very strong women as well, but it also took a quite long education process. Because in these spaces, people aren't well educated, and the men aren't well educated, right? And then you have the media who aren't well educated. So, sometimes you have to take your time and make sure that you put the groundwork in so that everyone's clear and can ask their questions and go through all that. It has to be a process. And that was good. And so when that was announced, some other countries have also followed that now, thankfully. But I always say, to crowds when I tell the story, I say, that was back in 2016, so how happy do you reckon the Socceroos are about that now? Because now the Matildas are like, they're the biggest brand in the country, right? So that time the Socceroos were there, and that's quite beautiful. So the process played into what was happening as well, and so now the Matildas, that's why I say they're a symbol in many ways, because now they're in a position where all women's national teams in the country are actually coming out and saying, well, hang on a minute, the Matildas put on business class and fly like the Socceroos, with staff on board so that they can be rested, so that have all the medical facilities, and so they can perform at their very best, and we're the Wallaroos or whatever, and we're doing this. So it's good. They've set a benchmark that all the other women's national teams can go to their governing bodies and say, here. So that's important. The next generation you were talking about are incredibly important. In my space of human rights, it's usually the young ones who are the most brave, and they're almost always right because it's so simple. Right? You just don't hurt people, do no harm. They're almost always right? But what happens is once we get responsibilities in life, once we get into political and power systems in life, we usually know what's right, but we're constrained from doing something. So the young voice is incredibly powerful. And I just want to finish by saying, in your environment or any institutional environment, what I find is that human nature kind of works to create groups, and there's always group dynamics. You see this a lot in sport, obviously in teams. So what happens is people get silenced when they actually might be the most clever, and people who are introverted get into a rhythm in a corporate environment where they're used to being shut down or not speak up. And then there's ones like me who talk a lot, and so they often take a lot of the space. Women know this because men do. So what I've found is, and I work in this in a coaching environment with kids, create rules, create an environment where everyone has the opportunity to be who they are, and you are always surprised, always, about the capability of people. So never make assumptions about people, what people want, know, or are capable of, because if you actually put them in an environment where they are free to do, you will be absolutely astounded. Yeah.
Great. Now, Ashley, you were named in Forbes 30 Under 30, so you are no stranger to positions of leadership and influence. What do you think are the key responsibilities when people hold positions of leadership and influence?
This is such a good question, and when I received this, it really made me stop and reflect on my own leadership journey, but also what I expect from other people. And for me, a lot of this comes back to justice, and I'd say justice is the value that sits under almost everything that I do, and it underpins the way that I think about issues, the way I approach issues, and that's also the place that Raise Our Voice Australia was created from. So when I started Rover in 2020, I had left some previous work that I was doing, and I was sitting in this space where I went, I'm still really passionate about this issue of equitable decision making, and particularly getting young women and gender diverse people who, let's face it, aren't just the leaders of tomorrow, they're leading today. We see this in so many informal spaces where young women and gender diverse people are on the forefront of making this change, but they're not necessarily sitting inside these systems and institutions, and there's a whole bunch of reasons for that. But at the time, I was also working in the public service, and I thought, well, as a leader and having this platform that I've been privileged to build over the last few years through having that work recognised, what is unique about me right now? What is the change that makes the most sense for me to make with what I know, with my experience, with my connections? And how do I democratise the access to some of that information and those connections? And from that, I designed, with the help of a mentor, but I designed Raise Our Voice's civic education program. And as part of that program, we were really deliberate in bringing in a diverse group of young women and gender diverse people, being really deliberate in the speakers and the presenters that we brought in, not only because we want to showcase leaders of all forms, but we really wanted this group of young women and gender diverse people from this diversity of backgrounds to see themselves reflected in leadership and not be met with a bunch of faces or experiences that didn't reflect their own experiences or passions or aspirations. So we were really deliberate in that. And we also set up the cohort with mentors. So recognising the power of mentorship, but also the power that can come with having somebody who's 2, 5, 10 steps ahead of you. And what I really wanted to do in designing that program was share, and as I said, democratise access to some of the powers and privileges that I had been able to build up, and make sure that I was actually sharing those with the next generation of leaders and my peer group. So can you remind me of the question, just to make sure I don't deviate too much from it?
That's all right. It was, what do you think are the key responsibilities when people hold positions of leadership and influence?
Thank you.
That's okay.
So with that, I think leaders do have a responsibility to bring people with them and to really ask, and I know we keep coming back to it, but there's a reason for that, who's in the room, who's not in the room, how is power functioning in this room? As you were saying earlier, Craig, I think being really deliberative as well about who's speaking, who's not speaking, why they might not be engaging. Maybe that viewpoint just isn't in the room at all, and that's a whole other process to go through. But as a leader, always thinking about who is missing from this space and what can I do to get them there? I also think there's a really important reflection piece here for us to remember that not every room is for every person. And you might notice that there is a particular background or viewpoint or perspective that's not present in a room. Go and have a chat to those people. Don't automatically assume that that is a room that they want to be in, because not all rooms are safe places for that person. You might go and have that conversation and they go, look, I'd love to be part of that discussion, but this is the experience I've had in the past, or this is what I'm coming up against. And if you're hearing that, not forcing the person to then enter that environment and maybe take a risk or step into that space of lack of safety, but engage with them and think about how you can not only shift those barriers, perhaps in the longer term, but how you can still bring and value and amplify that perspective. And to listen. I loved what you were saying earlier, Craig, again about division and how we're having these conversations and how we're, in a sense, really getting worse in this era of polarization and where this combativeness is being incentivized. We need to do so much more listening, and actually proper listening to engage, listening with respect, perhaps not bringing in some of those assumptions about who somebody is or their perspective, being able to separate ideas from people. Are we people that hold ideas, or are we a product of our ideas? And people in this room probably have different views on that, but it's also remembering that ideas can shift. And sometimes we do need to take people on a journey, but we can't take somebody on that journey if we're not listening in the first place, and if we've already written off that person and saying this bad idea makes you a bad person, therefore I don't need to engage. That's not how we can catalyse change. It's not how we can bring people along. But again, coming from my position of a white woman with relative social power, and I recognise the irony in me sitting up here and talking at you about this, but actually we have a lot of listening to do to be good allies. There's a lot more that we can always be learning from groups that have lived experience different to our own about what showing up looks like and how to do that really well and how to be a good ally. But the first thing we need to do to engage is actually stop talking over people, pass the mic and listen.
Great. Ursula, would you like to add anything on the responsibilities of people that hold leadership roles?
Yeah, having worked with a lot of leaders over the years, I think one of the things I learnt first and foremost was what they did well and what they didn't do so well. And that was actually quite an eye-opener and educational piece for myself in understanding what I believed worked well within a large organisation and in large departments. And one of the things that I felt the good leaders that I worked with and what I adapted myself was, the opening of doors, understanding your own privileges and knowing that you are on this planet for a reason and you need to start utilising those privileges in a way that help others. And if you have that gift and that ability, then it's hugely important that you recognise it in yourself, because some people I find don't actually see it in themselves, or they don't understand their own privilege and will continue getting on with everyday life and what consumes them every day. But it's about having that mindset and that stop and rethink of where can I actually help here, and it just scratching the surface a little can often open, I know this person, or I could open this door for this individual. And it could literally take you 5 minutes as opposed to someone spending potentially years. And I've seen it myself in communities I've worked where I have opened doors and provided space and a meeting and something where someone can have a conversation. They said, if I'd written for 20 years the same message, I wouldn't have got through. So to me, it's that part of leadership is just enormous if you can stop and pivot and think about where you're at and what you could do for another, and don't think that you're not able. I think you've got to understand what your privileges are, and the influence is there, and how lovely it is. It comes from a place of what you've learnt over the years, and there's nothing better than that, I don't think, anyway. Yeah.
Great. Craig, would you like to add on some key responsibilities?
Okay, well that was already brilliant, but I'll just make one point maybe, is that in my experience there is a vast galaxy of difference between authority and leadership. And we get the two confused, and so people talk about leadership because someone's in a position of authority. That can be inside an office, that can be anywhere. And so leadership, in my view, is two things. One is that the person who's an actual leader must genuinely care about the group. Okay? And secondly, they must put the group ahead of themselves. And what that means in difficult moments, taking responsibility for the group, for what's happened. And so authority means, I tell you what to do, here we're going to go do it. It messes up a little bit and you're to blame. Leadership is very difficult because leadership is, I'm going to work for you guys, I'm going to serve you guys and help you in every possible way. And then when it doesn't, and plus I'm going to give you the guidelines as to be the best you can be. And then when it doesn't, some of it doesn't go well, I'm going to take the heat. That's actual leadership. And there's not a lot of that around. I've been in a lot of environments, and so maybe some of you, I hope that you experience an environment like that, because that's a beautiful place to be. That's when you get a group that is together, treated equally, everyone feels safe, you know that you're not going to be blamed, and you know that this person has got your back. That's what we all should have. That's what I think life should be, basically.
Great. Ursula, as an experienced executive assistant in the public and private sector and also an advocate for them all, I'd love to know, what do you think is the cost of imbalance in the workplace today?
Oh, it's enormous. I think the biggest thing I've reflected on with this question is the loss of belonging, you know, particularly in our industry, because, you know, there is a sense of the reason we stick these roles out for extended amount of years and do the work at hand is there's a great sense of belonging. And what comes with that is the ability to operate in a powerful and confident position. And I think everyone that's in a role today would understand what it means to belong somewhere, and to know that you're accountable, that you're needed, that there is that opportunity to harness your capabilities and share with others. So for me, without that, you've got that lack of sense of self-worth, belonging and confidence, inequitable in terms of not having those individuals be able to share their amazing abilities in the workplace. It is actually a huge loss when we don't have that, and it can really show in organisations in terms of their foundation knowledge as well, because us women and the way that we work in this industry is we're very much the knowledge keepers, and we have a point of sharing knowledge with others and opening those areas for education and further mentorship and understanding various areas of an organisation. And we are I always like to say, you know, it's removing the titles and actually understanding that we are the work of these institutions and organisations in order to uphold those visions and those strategies that our leaders have moving forward. So without it, I'd like to think there wasn't so many great leaders in this world. So it's a huge loss, yeah.
Would you like to add anything on to that, Ashley?
Yeah, this question made me think about well-being. And I work with so many, again, incredible young women, gender diverse, and youth activists who are burnt out to buggery. They are so passionate about what they do. And they're wearing a lot of different hats in their lives. You know, they are obviously have to maintain paid work. Some of them are studying, many of them are volunteering, because actually a lot of change work happens outside the confines of paid formal employment, and these people are working for free, as many people are doing community care as part of that care economy. And then they're trying to participate as friends and partners and children and community members, and it's a lot of things to shoulder. In the workforce then as well, there is an imbalance when it comes to things like, again, if we speak to women in particular, we know women still shoulder the greatest burden of caregiving. And there's this pressure to work like you don't have children, then parent like you don't have to work. And how we think about balance in that sense, but also if you're part of a cohort that is underrepresented in your workplace, there's an inherent exhaustion having to do that advocacy. And you might have that additional expectation placed on you of, for argument's sake, very male-dominated workplace, you've got a gender equality staff committee, you're all volunteer, you are doing it in addition to your job, there's no recognition for it. Oh, but you're a woman, so why aren't you taking on all this extra work? And by the way, while you're there, I'm going to need you to unload the dishwasher, plan that morning tea, plan that birthday. I'm going to need you also to get all the food and clean up from it. So the way that those gendered expectations can also play into imbalance in the workplace, and then the way that being an underrepresented cohort in your workplace can tie into that imbalance by creating a greater mental and emotional load in your workplace to do that sometimes second shift of advocacy, or fighting to be in places that weren't designed for you. There's a real imbalance there, and to back up everything that Ursula said, it's our loss, but I think about it very much from a well-being perspective as well. We want to be well in all facets of our life, and work is such a big part of that.
Great. Craig, was there anything you'd like to add on, if there's any imbalances, the effects of that?
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca. I'm just going to mention three things really quick. One is the world. Someone's going to have to convince me that if there was more women in power and we had more balance there, that the world would be in the position that we're in. And by that I mean destruction of environment, the issues we've got with climate, everything. I just don't believe that's the case. And you know what? For once, I'd like to find out. So let's just give it a crack.
I'm working on it.
Right. Yeah, exactly. That's why you're ACT Woman of the Year. And then secondly, I was going to say, I work a lot in the refugee space. The only reason is because there's people in a lot of trouble regularly, and women and girls are disproportionately impacted by conflict. So I don't think there would be the conflicts that we have if we had more balance. And thirdly, I'm going to say domestic violence. Right? So I think we should connect what's happening to women in the country to the systems that puts men and women in, that's clearly creating environments where women are unsafe. And that's a whole big conversation, but a woman in Australia is being killed every 4 days, and we don't have the commitment to actually stop it. So I said yesterday, well, we just, did, we, as a country said, look, this group of women from another country who play sport need to be protected, but we should also make the point that our own women in Australia aren't protected. So.
Great. We touched a little bit on social media before and how, it continues to change the way marginalised groups are perceived. How do you think social media has changed the way marginal groups advocate for gender equality? It's a question to anyone that wants to take it.
I'll start. Look, that is an interesting topic, because I think that marginalised voices and people have a platform in social media, and they are connecting to institutions and organisations through that platform. The only thing I've witnessed is that you have people in those organisations and places that use that opportunity to validate something they're doing, but not necessarily follow through with, once the media and the hype is over in terms of where they were tagged or where they were represented. It's really the things that go on behind the scenes in terms of that follow through and how they were able to actually support off camera or offline, which really makes the biggest difference. So yes, it's there, and it's great that there is that channel to be able to have marginalised people come out and speak about their topics. It's just what's going on after, and how are they moving things forward, and who's connecting with them that isn't just there for, what's that called, marketing purposes, hype, rather than the actual action taken behind the scenes. Yeah, that's my point on it.
Great. Did you want to add on, Ashley?
Yeah, there are three things that I've seen, and again, I want to be really conscious of speaking from my own experience on this. One is connection. Social media has provided a fantastic opportunity to connect with people that you may not connect with otherwise, because you may not be in the same rooms as them, or the same city, or the same country. So the ability to connect and share experiences with other people who might reflect your experience, I think there's a lot of value and validation in that. The second is resources. Again, being able to connect people to resources that they may not otherwise have access to is a real asset. And the third, I'd say, is allyship. And again, back on that theme of listening, I know I've been quite conscious to cultivate my social media to make sure that I'm hearing from people whose experience does not reflect my own. And it's a real privilege to get to learn from them. I've learned so much from women and gender diverse and trans people of colour in particular. The work that, again, women of colour, gender diverse people, trans people do to educate others is such a load. It's a lot of work that goes into that, and we have a lot to thank them for, a lot to be grateful for. So it's a real privilege to get to listen and learn from these perspectives, and then use that to reflect on my own leadership and allyship, or being able to take those learnings into rooms to therefore be better at showing up and advocating. The point I would make under all of this, though, is that safety is such a huge issue. And as Craig touched on before with gender-based violence and the challenges of these spaces sometimes, and we know that rates of gender-based violence are higher for First Nations people, they're higher for people with disabilities, they're higher for people from culturally and racially marginalised backgrounds, and we've seen also a huge increase in gender-based violence and attacks directed at women in public spaces and public office. These spaces are becoming less safe, and I think we also have to be realistic that showing up online also comes with a big toll. And I don't have the answer for how we make these spaces safer, but I don't think we can have the discussion about how we show up in online and digitised spaces without recognising as well that that comes with an inherent cost and risk, particularly to more marginalised communities.
Yeah, that's for sure. Again, women, girls, minority communities are disproportionately affected on social media, attacked. I would say it's potentially an incredibly powerful tool of human connection, but like all human institutions, all human creations, it becomes polluted over time, it becomes political over time, and then becomes captured over time. This is just the natural process of human systems, basically. That's where we're at the moment. We're in a situation where it can really go off the deep end, and we need to think really strategically and collectively around what we're going to do with this thing now, particularly with AI. A few years ago, so in the human rights community, we recognise, I don't work in it, but I spend a bit of time in it, we recognise that social media saves lives, because in many authoritarian countries, and that's a term that is now being applied, could be applied to many countries, the only way that people can actually get the message out is through social media. And then now we're talking about people on social media need to be registered and all these things. Well, you know, if you're a LGBTI person, for example, in Saudi Arabia, you know, you can't do it under your own name, and so there's, you know, there's a range of complications there. This is why human rights need to always be part of all of these conversations, because all it does is try to balance the scale, as we say here this morning, for everyone. A few years ago, there was a kid that we ran a campaign to get out of a Thai prison, actually, and I think it was like 30 million people were involved. I think it might have been the largest campaign on Twitter that year. It was like 2019 or something. And Jack Dorsey, who was the head, who owned Twitter, came out to Australia to sit down, and we sat down for a few hours because he wanted to know basically how we did it and wanted to build some more tools, you know, to try and help us run these types of campaigns. It's kind of a shame that he's still not owning the thing. He was trying his best to make it as safe as possible. And now, of course, we have someone in there, Elon Musk, who's the complete opposite. There's a lot of coercion, there's a lot of silencing, there's a lot of censorship now happening across all these platforms. There's a lot of new ownership wanting to control what the public diet is. And so, you know, it's difficult times. You know, these are going to be difficult conversations. You saw that Australian government, you know, recently had this kind of ban for kids under certain ages and so on. I think all of these conversations are ahead of us. And again, they're ones that's really important that we have them in the right way. And at the end, or at the start and at the end, it should be just basically about keeping everyone safe.
Well, we've come to the end of this part of our discussion. I'd like to thank you all for such a thoughtful and engaging discussion. Everyone, please give our panel a massive round of applause. Now, before I let you run off the stage, I think there are some people in the audience that would like to ask some questions of you today. I'll open the floor for some questions. Anyone with a question, I might ask you to raise your hand so the roaming mics can find you easily. We might go, there's one here.
Good morning, my name's Sarah and thank you so much for your time and insights this morning. My question relates to what I'm reading on the message board and in my newsfeed at the moment around being labelled difficult as a woman. Both of you have experienced shaking feathers and pushing boundaries in your pursuits for equality. How do you handle negative reactions and attempts to suppress your voice in these pursuits?
Who'd like to take that one?
So if I heard that question correctly, that was saying, you know, the trope of the difficult woman and how do we manage that ourselves, perhaps playing that role of the difficult woman and handling the responses to that. Did I capture that? Great. Thank you for your question. Do you want to start or do you want me to start? You seem ready.
That was great that you reiterated the question because I couldn't quite hear it all together. However, I have been in that position quite a few times, and I like to say I start to channel the Dalai Lama. This is about also looking at the mirror reflection of the difficulties in terms of what you're challenged against. So I've had a big, I suppose, diverse world in reviewing different belief mechanisms, and I then will look at what is it that's burning up inside me in order to understand where that person's coming from, and then obviously the courageous conversation and breaking it down or trying to dissect it a little to understand where they're coming from and why it's why it's bringing up something in you, because my journey has been that there's always been something that has been somewhere buried in me that has ignited something in that other person, and hence this whole thing starts to kind of unravel. And I have had to look back at people I've worked with in challenging times, and with people that have challenged me, and it's upon reflection and dissecting that type of mirror situation that I've managed to get through. And for me, it's always been about taking that higher ground, but also then having the time to sit down and really explaining why that's alerting something in me and making it known to them so that they're aware of it. I hope that helps.
Thank you for your question. I should add as well, I know I was talking about high rates of violence. I also want to say I realise I excluded members of the LGBTQIA+ community also experience much higher rates of gender-based violence, particularly people who are not cisgender. I just wanted to come back and add that in because I realise I excluded that in my earlier discussion. Your question reminds me of an interaction I had with a man at a workplace when I was a teenager, and I was obviously ruffling his feathers, and he said to me, "No one's going to want to marry you." I thought that was so funny. Not only because that seemed to be the most brutal thing that he could throw at me in that moment, but I was like, do you think I aspire to get married? Is that my... So I think I've had this trope of being difficult for quite a long time. But I'm also an eldest first daughter, which means my default setting is anxious and responsible. And I'd be lying if I said that those things hadn't butted up against each other in the past. And again, if I'm being really honest, I think I've gone through seasons in my life, my identity and my confidence, where I have been much bolder, and times when I have retreated back into a more protective mode. And I think what that does as well is it almost ties into a theory of change question, where you think about perhaps how you want to progress something, whether it's a conversation or an idea or an issue. And it does require a bit of self-reflection on how do I do this? Sometimes it will be more appropriate to raise it in a one-on-one with somebody. Sometimes it will be through a broader discussion with a sense of humour. Sometimes it will be calling it out in an all-staff meeting. So thinking quite carefully about how do I get the best outcome here? And I think very rarely, I'm going to make an overarching statement that I will probably get off this stage and go, oh, I can think of contradictions. I don't tend to think that shame or humiliation is generally a useful tool. I think when people feel ashamed or humiliated, they do lash out. Nobody likes feeling ashamed or humiliated. So thinking about how to approach that, but also I have had times where obviously I've raised things that have been unpopular. And, I started my career in a very, very male-dominated institution and developed a reputation very early as being the resident feminist, capital T, capital R, capital F. And people did almost go out of their way to pick fights with me. And I was like a 23-year-old graduate, and I found that quite astounding that these middle-aged men would sometimes come to my desk to have a crack. And had to think very carefully about how to respond in those moments, because to them it was a game and to me it was personal. They weren't playing the issue when people were behaving like that. But when you're talking about a human rights issue or an identity that you hold or something that's really dear to you, your value, that is inherently personal, and it can be quite difficult to stay calm in those situations. But I also know how I feel when I walk away from those situations and I think, gosh, I really wish I'd said something. And that in itself is a particular type of regret. So I think over the years I've probably got more strategic in thinking about how I raise things, which feathers to ruffle at which time and to what extent. But also have become a bit better at premeditating, how do I actually have this conversation? So not just shooting from the hip, but thinking about how to bring it up, how does this person see this issue, how can I couch it perhaps within their worldview or echo some of their language or find those points of commonality and use that as an entry point, and have tried to be a bit more strategic about that. But at the end of the day, you also can't control how people receive things, and sometimes people get ruffled, and in that moment you do have to make a decision about how you're going to show up and respond to that. And while I'd like to say that I am always calm and polite and respectful, I can't hand on heart say that I get it right every time. I think there's also something in what Ursula said about thinking about what that brings up for you and being on that journey of, oh, that didn't feel right to me, why didn't it feel right? But when things are difficult, I put so much, I'm so lucky to have a great community around me, and having those people that can celebrate with you when a win goes well, but also commiserate with you when things are difficult, and they can debrief and they can rally and they can have that conversation and say, you know what, I'm really sorry, perhaps that didn't go the way you wanted, but maybe you did plant that seed, and we're still really proud of you for saying something. I'm not sure if that answers your question. I'm also open to hearing any other perspectives that people have. I think we're all on a journey with this. But also, I don't mind being difficult, because sometimes there are people that will inherently be upset by what you're going to say, and I think there's also a strategic decision in who am I upsetting? Am I upsetting the people who I want to be my allies, or the people who aren't? And if you're upsetting your allies, sure, do some self-reflection around that, think about how you're approaching things, but there's also an acceptance that some people are just going to be mad about it.
Great. We might move on to the next question just to allow.
I just want to say,
some-
if you're on a journey,
sorry,
you've gone a
Craig,
long way on the journey already at your age.
Thanks.
Yeah, that was a fantastic answer.
Great. All right,
Thanks.
next question.
Thank you for your discussions today. Have been insightful. Craig, you touched on the difference of 10 years ago compared to now, particularly in women's sport, and I'm wondering if you see a difference in the way we approach the conversation around balancing the scales now than we did 10 years ago.
Okay. So if I heard the question rightly, it's, so there's been a lot of change, and can we have the conversation better now than what we used to have 10 years ago? Okay. Yeah, I think you need visible symbols. All communities need visibility, and someone needs to be able to tell their story, or, if necessary, have people speak on their behalf. And therefore, one of the ways that change happens is people see it happening and it becomes normalised, and the Matildas are a part of all that. The thing I would say, though, at the moment that does worry me is that so we talked about social media, and there's really large, very well-funded campaign groups here now that are bringing the American-style system of misinformation and disinformation. We've never experienced this like we have in probably the last 5 years. The Voice was really elevated to a whole new level. So we couldn't actually have a conversation about The Voice anyway. It was just a shouting match, and therefore Indigenous Australia just got left behind in that. It really wasn't about them. It was just about different people who agreed or otherwise just kind of trying to kill each other. And I'm worried about that in a whole lot of different spheres, including women's rights. Because now, of course, language is critical. So that's why we see around the world at the moment a lot of efforts to police language. Okay, much more than we've ever experienced before, and there's very good reason for that. That's why in the feminist movement, and every movement finds language that creates a new reality for people. And once you have a language set, it's real for people. They can argue against it or not, but it doesn't exist until people can talk about it. And what's happening now is we've got the wokeness, okay, which I'm not even really totally sure what that is, but it seems to be women's rights, LGBTI rights, all of a sudden, and it's a powerful word because, as stupid as it is, it's real, and it's derogatory, and it can become pejorative, and all of a sudden, so now if you want to talk about difficult women and these types of issues, you've got to now pivot and find new language that becomes safe again and that everyone can come to and have a conversation. Because if you go into an organisation in Australia today and someone starts talking about wokeness and this and that, everyone's mind shuts down now. We can't actually talk about it anymore because what it does is it brings a political overlay. So now you're left or right. So if you're woke, you're left. If you're right, you're not woke. So that's the problem. My answer to your question is I think we've got difficult challenges ahead in all of these spaces, and I see really well-funded organisations pushing back on women's rights, and so you have to constantly remind people about where we've come from and why it's been important. Finally, the reason why it was a quite brilliant answer before is also advocacy is about impact, and there's many different types of impact, and I experience this as well. I always have to decide the language that I want to use in every sentence that I use, and because I've obviously been in the media a long time, I understand how it lands. And you take further risk, but all I say to people is make a conscious decision. And there is a very real place and very important place for absolute authenticity and telling the truth, and there's not enough of it. but it doesn't always bring change. That's just the reality, and if that's what you want to do, which sometimes I do, I know it's not going to make change, but I know it's a part of someone else being able to leverage it later for change, right? I'll give you an example. Like, I think a quite powerful example is Senator Thorpe here. You know, I often use Lydia as an example, because it doesn't matter if you agree with her or not, but you need someone pushing the real boundaries of truth, right, in every advocacy aspect, and you need the strong ones who actually are prepared to just, you know, whack Australia on the head. Because what it does is it opens space for the others to say, oh, well, geez, you know, sometimes Lydia goes a little bit too far, I know, but gee, that point that she raised, you know, that's quite interesting, isn't it? And so when I advocate, I make sure, if I'm not doing that, I find someone else who's going to do it alongside me. And so what you do is you get coalitions, so you go really hard and we'll be moderate, you know, so that's how change happens. So that's a long-winded answer to, you know, your question. Effectively what I'm saying is I think women in Australia now need to be more organised than ever. I think all of the allyship and all that stuff you definitely need. And you need to support, we need to support women who are in public places. Don't expect them to be perfect. Let them make mistakes, because men are allowed to make mistakes, and we need to support them in those moments. Because the more that get removed, the harder it is to, you know, get more people there.
Great. We will have time for one more question. Oh, yeah.
Hi. I just wanted to ask, and I'm sorry if this is quite ironic on International Women's Day, I was going to ask this question to Craig, so last question will maybe go to Craig. You've touched on it a little bit in terms of your role as an ally and as an advocate, and what that means when you can sort of represent on behalf of marginalised communities. You've touched on the very many ways you can do that with your sort of role and your status. Do you have practical tips maybe for people in day-to-day life as to ways that they can start doing that more in their life to sort of support and uplift the women around them?
Sorry, could you just...
Absolutely. Sorry, am I too far?
Yeah, just the final part. Yeah, the tip for...
It sounds so loud from here. So the tip,
This is good.
Just practical day-to-day tips of how people, particularly men, but sort of just anyone, can sort of be more of an ally and more of an advocate for the women in their lives, and ways they can sort of contribute.
You know, we were talking about advocacy before, and often the best path to impact, I'm not saying this is the best choice for everyone to make, but is actually to work through self-interest. Because Paul Keating made a very apt statement when he said, yeah, just like if you want to bet on anything, bet on self-interest, basically. And so I often try to talk to men through their own perspective of the women that they love and support in their lives. So, you know, men who have daughters is an obvious example, right? And I know that's imperfect, because men should support women's rights even if they don't have a female partner or a daughter, but it is a powerful entry point for all men. And so, or men with a heart, anyway. You know, again, it's about finding ways to tell the same story in a way that has meaning to the person. That's effectively what I'm saying. Who is this person? What are their interests? How are they going to respond to this issue? And instead of we're just going to butt heads here and I'm not going to have any impact on them whatsoever, I might feel better because I can get to yell at them and feel morally superior. That might be okay if that's what you want to do. But if you're talking about advocacy and supporting women's rights and let's get somewhere, every forum that you go into, the tip is try and understand who it is that you're talking to and calibrate your language and the message to hit them in the heart. That's how you make change.
Great. Thank you, everybody, for your questions, and thank you again to the panel for sharing. Can we please give them another big round of applause?
Okay.
Thank you, Beck, and thank you everyone for your questions. And thank you again, Ursula, Ashley and Craig, for being so generous with your time this morning. Now, I would like to invite the President of the Senate, the Honourable Sue Lyons, to present you with a gift on behalf of the Women in Parliamentary Departments Working Group.
I'm not supposed to speak, but I do want to thank, it's because I'm the President, I'm using my authority, Craig. I do want to thank the committee for organising this event. They do it in their own time, Ashley, and thank the departments they come from for enabling them to do this work, but to give us time this morning to stop and to listen to the amazing contributions from the panel and to stimulate our own thinking. So thank you for giving me particularly the space this morning just to sit and listen and to absorb what's been said, and it's just been terrific. So thank you very much.
Amazing. Thank you, everyone. Please feel free to help yourselves to some morning tea. We will reconvene for the breakout session at around 11. We hope you stick around for it. After the break, please pick a seat on one of the breakout tables. Please also have a read of the messages that are rotating on the screens to the side of the stage. The working group asked Parliamentary Department employees to submit a small note on what justice, fairness and being heard means to you in your workplace or community. Thank you.